Welcome to the presentation of Becoming the Product, the Critical Internet Researcher as a Virtual Intellectual. So we have Morgane Billuart here, the author, and she has Helena McFadzean as a discussant. So Morgane is a French writer and visual artist. She graduated from Garrett Riefeld in Amsterdam and studied at Cooper Union in New York, and as affiliated researcher of the Institute of Network Culture. She published her book Cycles in the Sacred and the Doomed. That's the last book, and on the realm of female health technologies, and she studied in the MA of cross-disciplinary strategies in Vienna, and has exhibited and widely and written in books and magazines. And Helena, she is a writer, editor, and curator, and also cooperated in the making of the book. And she also curated and also worked on artist research project aerobic topologies. This sounded really interesting also. And you also do podcasts sometimes, and also the book seems to be a podcast. I thought not.
Not exactly, but I'll explain.
But yeah, okay, you'll explain. Okay, so yeah, I'm curious as a boomer to hear about this this thing. What is it about? So yeah, I'm looking forward. So the words to you. Yeah, Set Margins, really great publisher. Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming. Nice constellation of many people that I know from very different places, so that's great. And thanks for the one who came from the misread also, because we tried to spread the word. Today I will be presenting this small book, which is, as you just introduced, entitled Becoming the Product, the Critical Internet Researcher as a Virtual Intellectual. Just for the one who perhaps don't know me, I will just quickly introduce myself. So there was a brief introduction, but in general my practice focuses on critical assessment of like social and economical implication of technology. I'm currently shifting my practice a little bit into something else, which is more hardware related, but that will be for future projects. If you are interested, at some point I can share some things. I'm mostly doing book writing, also a little bit of short films, and I have also a podcast practice, which I will relate to that book later. And these are just some extract from films and visual stuff that I've also been working on. Okay, so coming back to the book, we're going to start with the topic of Joshua Starella. And the reason why I want to introduce this person is, for the ones who don't know, he's an internet critic, and he's actually right now, I think, really much more focusing on, let's say, politics, specifically in the United States. But the reason why I want to mention him is because in 2020, I think, I didn't know about him, but a friend of mine shared a post online that he shared on Instagram, where he said that he was going to quit his teaching position in an art university to become an full-time online content creator. And he already had back then, I think, quite a big online audience, mostly on Discord, Instagram, and also Patreon. And the reason why this got my interest is because as I was myself doing critical internet research, which I will define in a moment, I was thinking and observing all this sort of trend and sort of like thing that I was seeing exploding online that was not specific only to Joshua Starella, but of people who were studying digital culture and critical internet research, and who were mostly producing and showcasing their content online and not within institutional setting. It's not a clear boundary that I want to operate with today, but it's just that it was something that I was observing and I was really interested in. And I just want to mention, it was just his quote from a very long Instagram story where he was explaining why he didn't want to do that anymore. Mostly because he didn't believe in the institutional, let's say, structure and funding system, specifically in the United States, but he just briefly formulated, this September, I'm not going back to teaching. I spent the past few years arguing against the idea that online platforms could be suitable replacement for institutions, but now I'm leaving the university jobs to become a content creator. I think this is something very specific to him. He was already famous and, let's say, sustainable enough to do that. I do not recommend. I cannot also do that myself. If you have a job, keep your job, okay? The economy is terrible, as we all know, so that's not, but he could do it, luckily. And so I was just starting to reflect a little bit on all of these things. I was mostly also myself, let's say, researching and listening to a lot of online content creators online that were doing internet analysis or just like digital culture criticism. You can mention Joshua Citarella, who was doing it in a specific way, but I just want to mention like internet analysis, which is also a very big let's say YouTube influencer that also does that and who also studied media theory in the first place but became really big on YouTube. You also have Kidology, who does a lot also of like social commentary on like internet cultures. So I was just observing all these people who studied like humanities and like were looking into internet culture and like different kind of trends, and I was very interested myself in, well, not only their emergence, but also just the fact that they had such a big audience online that seems to best benefit their discourse and also the commentary around their discourse, creating an interesting feedback loop for their practice. So the questions that I was mostly concerned with when I started to think about this, but also specifically more thinking about this book, was, is there an existing lineage of critical internet research? And how do artists and researchers in digital and internet culture monetize and render their work visible? So that was like the broad scheme and slash question that I started to work with. And I just want to quickly say that it was also a personal quest and question for me, because 3 years ago I started a podcast which I call Becoming the Product. Not really sure why, but I was like, this is a good name. Because I was really thinking about how to best present research online. And I didn't know how I was going to do it. I also made this weird logo on Cinema 4D back in the days, which is not representative of anything that is a product. And for 3 years, I was posting monthly episodes that were related to digital culture and media theory. I will just name a few of these podcast episodes so you have an idea of like what was the topic implemented in it. So for example, the digital mundane, risk and potential, love is blind, dualism and mind enhancement, machine learning and meme making, and artificiality and emotions beyond the flesh. So I was a little bit psycho back in the day because I was always like, oh, once per month I'm going to start searching a topic that I like, I'm going to research a lot, read, and at the end of each month I'm just going to produce a podcast where I record my voice and put the bibliography there. And I was doing that because mostly I started to realize that whatever I was doing at school, mostly art school, I just couldn't manage to have interesting conversation with like most of my teachers. I couldn't really manage to have a lot of feedback. And I realized that most of the people that were doing similar things as me were actually quite present online, slash sharing online, slash getting visibility online, commentary, etc. So I was thinking, okay, I'm just going to start doing that myself. And this is why I called this Becoming the Product back in the days. So coming back to the book, when I had to do my master thesis, I was reflecting on these topics a lot, and I was thinking about wanting to do something about the podcast. And then I started to think, okay, why not try to bridge all of this together and reflect on the production of critical internet research nowadays. So I just want to quickly introduce a little bit what's in the book, and then I will go a little bit more into kind of details. But of course, the first thing I had to do was to look into what is internet studies, right? And I have a small first chapter on the ever-changing status of internet studies. And in that chapter, I tried to like understand a little bit like how it came to be, let's say, established outside of institutions, but also in institutions. Because with the emergence of the internet, of course, you had a lot of people who started to like think about how media theory could take on this internet studies topic. But of course, this discipline being very young, it was very difficult for universities and also institutions to acknowledge it as like as relevant and as, let's say, justifiable for funding and stuff than like history or like art history or philosophy and whatnot. And quite quickly on, I decided to look into, let's say, two key figures for the ever-changing status of internet studies, which were Gerd Loving and Joshua Citarella, because I think they're two relevant figures when it comes to that topic. First, Gerd Loving, because for those who don't know about Gerd Loving, he's a quite key figure of early net criticism, and he's one of the figures that also founded media studies department in some universities. So when no one believed that studying the internet was relevant, he was arguing for it, and he was constantly just trying to like build an argument for that. And he was doing it when no one was doing it. He was doing it when no one wanted to believe in it. So he's like a key figure for that. And so looking into him as a lineage of critical internet research was like very relevant. And then I also looked into Joshua Citarella, not as a lineage of Gerd Loving, but as a, let's say, more recent formation of that, as someone who is also an internet critic, but that is very different model revenue and visibility, let's say, system. And then in the second chapter, I looked a little bit into this ideal of the self-organized critical internet researcher, right? Because once we acknowledge that this might be a new interesting model, we have to look, of course, into how it, to some extent is an interesting ideology, but is very individuality driven, remains on a lot of like precarious kind of practices because you are always outside of the scope of institutional support. But at the same time, you can also trace it back to the history of patronage in general, which, for the long history of art and critical thinking was often funded by philanthropists and mecenas. So the argument I'm trying to make in the book is that, being a self-employed critical thinker is maybe not that different to what existed back in the days, but it's just that you have micro payments from people instead of having one key figure of an extremely wealthy person that funds you. Now that we exist as in this metaphor of becoming the product, which means doing critical internet research on the internet, that's when the metaphor of the idea of becoming the product comes along, right? So what does it mean to do theory with influencer stylings, right? Because when you produce theory online, you cannot make it as boring as an academic paper because, that's the thing you're trying not to do, basically. So I talk a little bit about this idea of influencer styling of theory, and also some kind of criticism, right, of like what does it mean to produce research at the pace of the attention economy? Because if there's one thing that's actually quite good, let's say, about academia and institution, is that the funding and the time available makes it possible for people to research things for years and not make quick statements. But at the same time, you could say that academia will never be fast enough for technological critique, because the moment that a new problematic platform comes, the research paper about it comes like 5 years later or something. So I'm kind of trying to discuss like the question of like the timeline on those wonders, because you want to be able to do internet critique rapidly, but you don't want to do it to a point where like the necessity for constant content production diminish the quality of the work. So virtual intellectual in the process of becoming. So I talk about the concept of becoming the product, and also, which I will describe a little bit later, the idea of the theory girl, because Joshua and Gert are both white males, and there's actually a lot of other people that are doing internet criticism online that uses the, let's say, online performativity of being a girl online, which is also a sort of like strategical tool to also catch attention, to be able to deliver theory. And I will go back to it in a little bit. And mostly, in the end, I had the opportunity and luck to be able to interview Gert and Joshua and two women, Alex Kisho and Sophie Public, on the question matter, because I was thinking it would be nice to also get their opinion on the entire subject matter, know about the strategy, etc. If you want to know more, you should get the book. Okay, so as I said, Gert Loving, for those who don't know about him, he's an interesting figure, also somewhat quite controversial in his methodologies, but that's the thing, right? It's like he's not purely, let's say, conservative in his methodologies and in his arguments, so he also got a lot of attention for that, but is also criticized in the academic world for that exact same matter. But the question is always, do you want to be academically and methodologically consistent, or do you want to engage critically with the world and get the feedback that you need to be able to bring awareness about internet critique and technological development? I brought him and analyzed a little bit this research institute that he funded, which is called the Institute of Network Culture, as an example of like what does it look like when you produce critical internet research online. So the Institute of Network Culture is organizing book launch, book production, conferences, etc., throughout the years, for the last 20 years, and has been able, thanks to the support of an applied art university, which it finds itself in, to fund this critical research project. And it's going to close in a year and a half, unfortunately. So it's going to be also very interesting to know what's going to happen to the future of that institution once it's, let's say, deinstitutionalized, although it was always a little bit on the border of being a marginal space. Okay, you also have a lot of like INC, Institute of Network Culture production here, in case you're interested, just on this corner. Okay, Joshua Citarella, as I said, artist and writer who coined himself as an internet critic, and we also discussed this in an interview. What does internet critic means exactly? It's this kind of like loose terminology that is not specifically self-explanatory, but is about social and critique commentary of the internet. Who has, let's say, initiated and runs the platform Do Not Research, which is a very different kind of model, but as a similar to me line of inspiration of Institute of Network Culture. It posts blogs and sometimes produces books based on those articles that are submitted and sent, and has its own kind of revenue model based on subscription, Patreons as well, and also people who pay for the books when they're out. So of course, as I said, we can talk a lot about those two people, but it would be also underlying the fact that there's a lot of other people that are doing this, and that interestingly enough, the concept of being a girl online and doing internet research is very relevant, still also dangerous sometimes, and I will explain why. To do that and to research that, I looked into Sophie Public, who is also a digital culture and internet teacher at the Angewandte, who focuses a lot of her practice now on occultism, but also a lot on like the concept of the girl online and how the girl online can be a strategy to deliver discourses. There's a sort of performativity and maybe naivety on the surface that comes with it into the way you present yourself, dress up, etc. But it's actually just some kind of like subversion to be able to deliver the theory that you actually want to implement. The other researcher that is also a key figure in that, let's say, performativity and is also interviewed in the book is Alex Kisho, who's also a writer and a critical theorist, and who has literally wrote recently a small book that was published with Axioma, who's called Girl Intelligence, and she's really deconstructing this idea of the girl stack, if I'm correct, understanding how like this scope of the girl online and how she's being perceived can be like a weapon also to some extent. So once again, some of the things that I just mentioned in terms of like talking about the platform, either it's Institute of Network Culture or Do Not Research, are mentioned in the interviews, and also this performativity and tool of the girl online is also discussed with these two women in the last interview. I just want to mention that this book was written in the scope and in the lineage of all these people that I've mentioned, and I want to take the opportunity to mention some books that are really interesting / important, I think, to understand the bigger question. Dark Fiber by Gert Lovink, which is the publication of his PhD, basically, I think in 2002. Digital Method by Richard Rogers, which is also an interesting book. I don't know if you know about it, but it's about trying to understand how you can use or create new methodologies for studying the internet in academia, which is a very discussable thing, but an interesting read. And Outworlds by Howard Baker, which is also a very relevant book for understanding the history of patronage and mecenat, explaining that it's very recent, this idea of state-funded art, and that for the history of the art practices, the funding most of the time had to be private. So it gives a little bit of perspective on like how to best organize and rethink how we can fund critical thinking and art nowadays. And finally, Digital Plenitude by David J. Butler, which is also very interesting because it talks about this sort of like flattening of knowledge making in the age of digital practices, which enable the rise of, let's say, critical culture in a more democratic way than it used to exist, right? Because often, or before, academia used to be this like reserved thing, and now new media has enabled to have this discourse come to the hand of way more people and more democratically. And now, I wrote Q&A with Helena. Helena, well, she could introduce herself best, but also has like a fit into this kind of like both worlds, and is implemented in projects that also deal with academia and digital culture, and edited the book. So I was thinking it would be a great opportunity to discuss some of those things with her. And I don't know if we start with this or if anyone has any comments, but we can also do the Q&A or whatever commentary you have.
Yeah, I was just curious, your question about what does it mean to do theory with influencer styling is really interesting. But I was wondering how, in your thinking, like, do the affordances or the sort of shapes of different platforms also affect that, right? Like TikTok versus X or Blue Sky, or Mastodon is like very different styles of platforms.
Yeah, I think if you do a YouTube video, critique essay, you can take the time to expand, etc. If you do a TikTok video, of course, it has to be more and more catchy and stuff. I think it's really interesting to see like the different strategies that exist, but I'm afraid that sometimes, specifically on TikTok, like the shorter is the format, the more kind of clickbaity it has to be. And sometimes I like to think that, I was thinking about this the same. I was thinking each episode of the podcast is like 30 minutes. How would I put it on TikTok? I was like, what's the catch-up line? And I just couldn't find an answer for myself. So I think sometimes you also get really limited by the scope. But at the same time, I think that it is way more challenging and interesting to think about how to bring people into critical thinking through TikTok than through video essays. Because video essays is just on YouTube. It's like basically what you are could do easily, etc. I can only think of TikTok and YouTube right now. I don't know much about Thread. Twitter, I think it's not a really good place for elaborating. What is interesting with TikTok, for example, is that TikTok is really limiting for sending you to another point, right? You can only get an extra link to somewhere if you're like an affiliated something. So it seems like they really want to cut short the possibility to go somewhere else. It's like this kind of... but I would say that it takes a really big amount of skill set and knowledge and intelligence to be able to do critical thinking on TikTok, because to get a point in that format and to actually induce people to go see something else, yeah, I wish I knew how to do that, but I don't. Yeah.
And I do think that's a point I kind of want to build on a little bit, because you were also a guest on a podcast that I'm like co-hosting called Disintegrator. I'm not sure, maybe one or two people in this audience have listened to it before. But yeah, Morgane came on as a guest, and we also had this conversation about these topics. And you said this really nice thing that I really appreciated, which was like we were talking about the speed and like acceleration of like producing research online as a critical internet researcher, as this like figure, or as people who are para-academic and showcasing their work on different platforms with different speed requirements, I would say, or like frames. And you said something that I thought was really nice, which was like, just because it's possible, it doesn't mean that it's like wishable. And yeah, that was really nice, because it's like, yes, a lot of these things are happening more online, but it's also still a question of like, where does one want to present one's research and why? So I guess that's how I would respond to that question, in a very like workaround way.
Probably would be interesting to hear both of your opinions on, because you said you were going to speak more about the methodology. Did I miss it?
The methodology in the book, or?
Yes, in the book, or of internet research in general.
Well, that's the interesting thing. It's like, if you look into the practices of Gerd Loving and Joshua Citarella, they would actually say that the methodology is quite experimental. Let's say you want to write about a new trend on the internet, right? Some people would argue that you need to like bring it back to some like concrete hardcore theory and like make it a little bit more like, let's say, related to that topic. But to make sense of it, let's say. But for example, Gerd and Joshua both argue that you need to like use new canons, because actually, apparently, in their own ideology, the canon that academia was being built on does not relate to the world anymore, and like the references that we are now inheriting from are maybe like not so helpful. I don't know if I fully agree with that. I think it's good to like know a bit the lineage of thinker before you, and not just be like, oh, I saw this on TikTok, you know, because that's the danger, and that's okay, and that's also the main criticism. In the book, I do not talk about methodology, but I do talk about the critique of critical internet research, because there's many things that, to some extent, if we look at it from like a scientific or quantitative, whatever perspective, are not extremely accurate. But the counter-argument I would make to that is that, and that's a question we can also ask to everyone, you know, it's like, do you want to make a critique that is like so specifically scientifically proven, or do you want to bring a certain sense of awareness on a topic that you think is urgent to shed light? For example, I saw TikTok and YouTube answering way faster to some like topics that were technologically, let's say, complex or socially complex than I saw papers and scientific people speaking about. One example, which is not really harmful, but for example, like the tried wife concept, right? Of this new ideology of being at home and like having a provider man and stuff. It would take so much time to do a proper sociological study into this, which I think needs to be done. But if you want to break awareness for all the young people that are looking at TikTok, perhaps it's good to deconstruct it on the go, and then the methodology is a bit porous. But it's just a different kind of knowledge making, and it's a different kind of scope, I would say. Because will this young girl who are like 12 to 13 read an academic paper about tried wives? I don't know. So I think it's about admitting that different kind of institution and practices needs to be researched, but I think it's good to be a bit experimental and a bit, I wouldn't say fast, but like reactive, more than thinking too much about the methodologies. That's my own take on it.
But I think also what's interesting is that like there are new methodologies emerging by the fact that research has places online now that are also like shaped by research interests, so shaped by platform dynamics, but also sometimes by factors that are really also favoring that type of research. And Morgane's like writing about the critical internet researcher. These are often also like people that are theorizing the internet and media and things that are happening at a pace that don't really have a place in traditional academia. That's on like platforms and speed. And
but that being said, I want to mention, which is also just to acknowledge all the people that we mention in this book and also us, we have a educational/academic background. So it just goes to say that like, even if we don't want to acknowledge it, we have inherited from some methodologies. I think it would be wrong to say that we are just super experimental.
I wanted to ask, what's the general trend then among this like para-academic bubble? Is they have to develop like a methodology to like live up to like this institutionalized scientific approach, or are they trying to preserve this bubble with their own kind of rules? You already told us what's your opinion, but I'm interested in like what's the general debate, because like you said, some of these porous theories, like not methodology set in concrete, it's being also criticized, and there's been debate about it. So I'm curious to know, like, in what direction the whole thing's developing. Is it trying to be more scientific, like to imitate some of this institutional research, or is it trying to stay more independent of it?
there are certain practices of research that don't have a place in traditional academia because of the requirements of the responsiveness and the kind of very contemporary nature of what is being researched. Especially when it comes to like network cultures and these types of things. I think it's interesting that in these theory bubbles, let's say, maybe also there is more of an interest in kind of like changing how research is done generally because it's like critical research. I don't have any concrete examples because I'm not a scientist. I'm like from a humanities background, and so I wouldn't know what that would kind of materialize as for like people that are doing more kind of para-academic, let's say, science or like natural science research. That's my workaround answer to that. That I can't give you like a definite answer of the general trend, because I think it really depends on like what interests people are trying to fulfill with research and what kind of remnants of the traditional academia they still hold within them as well. But there are loads of different examples of different models that exist, and Morgane kind of gets into it in the book as well, of like people that follow a kind of researcher influencer model where it's kind of very like independent, kind of not connected to these mediating structures, or however you want to call it. And then there are also more like para-academic entities that see themselves also as this like thing that's outside of the individual. So I guess those would all operate differently as well.
Yeah, to add to that, maybe I think this is something that is very specific to this discipline, but you don't see it so much, for example, in like mathematics or like history. I think that's the entire conversation, right? It's because it's a new discipline, because it's a discipline that borrows from other discipline. You have this entire conversation around it in ways that other disciplines do not feel affected, because they're like so hegemonic and the methodologies are so rigorous that there's no room for conversation. Because the influencer model is perhaps relevant to some corporation, museums and stuff, sometimes the institution are actually curious about the methodologies of those individuals. So, for example, Joshua, in the interview he says no, but I still believe that whatever expertise he's building on, like building his audience, having this feedback, collecting those things and stuff, are very relevant for museums, corporations, think tanks and stuff. So he's creating a different kind of knowledge that might be useful. But it doesn't say so much about, let's say, questioning his methodologies and stuff. It's like a new sort of field of knowledge that can be applied to other things. But I would definitely say that this conversation, I haven't seen it happen in, let's say, more historically approved field of disciplines.
I think it really kind of belongs to this like transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, or even like network culture based, or like basically I think these methodologies are attractive to people who are interested in from the beginning in like doing the kind of research that might not like have a home in institutions where that's just like stifled.
I was wondering, maybe it's also adding to the question, is like the idea of peer review applicable at all, or what kind of form could that be in this new network culture?
There is for Institute of Network Culture and Do Not Research a group of people who read it and comment, and I don't think they would publish, not everything can be published, but it's definitely not as rigorous. But what I think is interesting, and I think Becoming Press can also talk about it, is this idea of peer-reviewed network of people who are knowledgeable in that field and who review each other's text. I don't know, I think that's also a strategy, right?
I mean, if you don't mind me interjecting, I can say like what was being discussed earlier reminds me of a conversation I had with someone that I mentioned to you a few days ago, this Louis Morel, who really believed that yes, there's a difference in methodology when you don't have the chance to do as much research or do as much peer reviewing as you would in an academic context, but there's really something important and special about what you mentioned with acceleration and velocity, that there is a new stage that is becoming very relevant that academia maybe not have predicted, which creates a kind of split. You will end up with one stage that operates extremely fast, and a philosopher or an interesting person or a commenter or something that can respond to something so fast that it is incredible and it's impressive, and this is going to become important to find the meeting point between the two possibilities of rigor and velocity, because the two have a lot of value. And the fact that you can actually reach so many people with a story, and so fast, and so off the top of your head, that actually the story format, it may have seemed like a kind of banal part of social media for a long time, going back to like Snapchat in the UK 15, 20 years ago, let's say. The idea of the story and the value and the potential it has is kind of changing the game a little bit. And I think there's going to need to be a point where we strategize, and maybe other people are already in this process of strategizing what we can do, where you take advantage of the velocity of the Instagram story, and then you have the traditional methods that would then follow these kinds of things. So what is the meeting point? I don't know. Because yes, I mean, also peer reviewing is the kind of thing that it can take different amounts of time depending on what rigor you're looking for. So you can do kind of 10-year peer reviews, or you can do a 1-year peer review. And I think that we're going to end up with this kind of scaled, sort of, this new version of academia is going to be both institutionalized, non-institutionalized, but it's also going to be operating on many different scales, and it's probably going to follow a kind of capitalistic fragmentation model where everybody starts inserting themselves at a different speed and at a different rigor, and then there's going to be a kind of broad network of different kinds of levels and different kinds of speed. So you'll be following your Instagram stories for one thing, and then you might follow up with it somewhere else. So I think you can find a balance, but I think this is going to become really important. I mean, it's difficult to say what's going to happen in the future because it's being figured out now. Stories as a technology have only been working as well as they do, and for a relatively short amount of time. I mean, stories have only existed for the length of a single peer review, so I think that that's what's going to be interesting for us as publishers and writers and researchers, is like, how can we use both, and then how can we fuse both, and how can we then find what is the possibility after, because if you can have rigor and velocity, then it's a different game.
And I think also what's really interesting is that these kind of disruptive practices, let's say, are like seeping into the requirements of academia. There are all these increased demands of like also, you know, what kind of attention do you bring to your institution. It's all about the attention economy, really, like this conversation, I would say, and how to manage it and how it's seeping into a lot of different knowledge-making practices and how they make themselves visible. We have this very cute catalogue of possible questions, and I'm going to bring this one out now because I think it's very relevant and important to ask the question of, like, is it even possible? And I'm going to direct this to Morgane. Do you think it's possible still now, as like someone who's producing knowledge academically or para-academically, to even like opt out of these platform dynamics?
Sometimes I'm considering it because, like, for example, I have this podcast and I have a Substack and blah, 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 and I have so many things, but it's like not generating any money. And sometimes I'm like, should I just stop? But then I'm like, if I stop, who's going to read my work? Like, should I just completely change like the topic even? Because that's the thing, I think when you produce this kind of specific research, you want some kind of conversation around it, hopefully. And I'm thinking, if I don't publish online, if I don't do this, if I don't do that, I just feel like I'm just going to be doing it for myself, which is great, but I seek to, you know, have this kind of moment in my life. So I don't know if I can opt out, really. I think it's that's the thing, it's you're used to being kind of like just a little bit on the margins of other disciplines, so you take that habit and then you never really get comforted by academia or institution, because what you're doing is always a little bit like not, it doesn't really fit a specific funding, it doesn't really speak a specific kind of branch of whatever application. So you get used with this idea, and then before you even know it, you're like even more marginalized in it. Yeah, so I don't know if one can opt out. I think it's, anyway, this question of deplatformization and stuff is a question even for, like, for example, Joshua and stuff, because, well, there used to be a time where we thought, you know, governments is going to back us up anyway, but I don't know if that's true anymore. So, you know, if you're being left out here and there, well, yeah, true, the platform could also disappear or like kick you out or shadow ban you, but it feels like a lot of terrain are a little bit porous right now, so I think that's also why people are playing on different fields. And that's also something that I want to mention. I think a lot of people that I talked with, and even myself, and also you know that from your work experience, if I'm correct, it's never that black and white. It's not like people are doing critical internet research and have nothing to do with the academic world. People are doing academic world and have nothing to do with the corporate world. I mean, you see this kind of like weird mix that is happening currently right now of like academics who are working for think tanks and influencers that are working like for consulting in museums. Like, it becomes this strange weaving of knowledge exchange, which I suppose is quite good, but at the same time it makes everyone a little bit more precarious, I have the feeling, because it's just this kind of like, yeah, snippets of exchange, but no one is really truly supporting anything, like concretely, you know. Unless when you're an individual and you're trying to like monetize your own practice, then you're trying to support yourself. But I would say, and that's my own personal take, I think it's also just very healthy to work a little bit in those different areas, because I have never worked in academia, but I just feel, and I'm happy to hear if anyone works in academia, that a lot of people are also fed up with their own system there. Bureaucracy, methodologies. So I think everyone is happy to actually trade a little bit of time and expertise in other fields, it seems, because once you're stuck in one bubble anyway, it just seems like it's not good for your mental health.
There is a really nicely phrased question. I'm also just going to actually read it out because it's so well phrased, that I think fits really well here. And it says, as traditional institutions face increasing budget cuts, what do we think happens to the legitimacy of critical thinking? Can it survive without institutional support? And are universities our only options? I guess we kind of answered it already, but or we kind of touched on it, but this idea that like the institution sometimes doesn't really provide the kind of feedback that we're like looking for. Yeah, what kind of hopes do we maybe still have for them?
Yeah, I mean, this is something. Oh, maybe you want to say something.
No, please.
No. But if you have something to say.
Yeah. The idea of the dark forest came into my mind, and maybe someone knows more than me right now about it, and I have just very vivid memory of it, what it tells by Busta and Little Internet. And what they're introducing there is the new type of audiences emerging and platforms, meaning that I had a feeling that we're speaking from the perspective of the content creators, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that the audiences themselves are also very much shifting, and also the type of focus and attention economies by that also created. If we have different type of knowledge levels, meaning that we have this, for instance, the meme of Tradwife, which was mentioned earlier, which can consume anyone, basically, because it's very, very accessible. But at one point, it's also interesting for the people to access certain type of knowledge, which is more hidden. Secret knowledge is always interesting, and it's always going to be in trend. And those type of knowledges are not always accessible, and it's maybe also interesting to consider how to create platforms, or how to embed that type of, or let's say that perspective on the audience and type of knowledges, and yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit the dark forest in the book, but I haven't dived too much into it. But I think it's true to say that this audience, and I will speak here about, because in the dark forest they mentioned a lot this kind of thing that happened throughout Discord and stuff, like it creates almost its own, let's say, like semiotics and like visual language that becomes a genre in itself. That I think is fascinating. But that I haven't treated too much, just because I would think that a study of that would need to benefit from like a specific object of study, like of an image, something, which Joshua Sterla did a lot, for example, by looking at specific kind of memes and stuff. But yeah, the question of the audience, I haven't looked too much into it into the book, because my assumption is somehow that like the people who are interested in this topic find those, let's say, content creators / influencers, and then what is really interesting though in that context is that then there's this kind of like network building around the audience that benefits actually all of those people. So it creating its own network based on finding those key figures. And I can say that for Gert Loving, for example, by creating the Institute of Network Culture, like there's this entire range of affiliated researchers that are like working together, producing together. And same for Do Not Research. It's like a lot of people are collaborating, a lot of people, and I think this is also the very beautiful things about these models is that, as you say, like not only the audience is specific, but the audience is so specific in its niche that they also find collaborators and ways to expand on their practices. I don't know if that answers exactly your question, but I did not look too much into the audience into it, because to be honest with you, if we speak about Joshua Sterla, for example, the audience is so broad. Like it goes from like the trolley to the incel, and there's me in between. Like, you know, it's like a lot of different people are interested in those kind of research. A lot of people are studying a lot of different research questions in those research. So I would say that it's very difficult to say who is the audience, but what I can say for sure is that the audience seems happily enough to collaborate and to produce new forms of knowledge together. Yeah.
But can I ask you, when you were formulating this question, did I understand this correctly, that you were also getting into a bit this thing that like the consumers are the creators as well type thing, where like everyone kind of has skin in the game? That's not really the dark forest thing, but you were kind of talking about the change in audience and like kind of maybe how attention is as a marketable thing, maybe changing.
I think it touches also, of course, in that topic that we're not seeing the audience just as a grey default mass, but the audience itself can be proactive or more, depending on what their interest is and how they want to relate to the content. So I think that will be maybe also interesting to shed light into this dark forest of users, to see how what possibilities and emancipatory tools do they have in order to co-create content and not just be consumers. And again, attention economy, which is sucking out our focus and so on and so forth. But, yeah.
But just to add to this, for example, there's an interesting moment when we talk with Joshua about it, where he says that, for example, on Do Not Research, there's very specific kind of articles that work better than others. And it's apparently, like the more experimental one, the more deconstructive one and stuff like this. And so I think, as a matter of fact, if you think about Do Not Research as an institution, because it wants to have more views and more engagement, they're going to benefit this kind of research more and more. So like as the platform grows and as the people who are reading this want less and less, like let's say, methodologically rigorous text, like they're going to promote even more of those things. And this is what you're going to see more and more. So this is kind of like reinforcement of its own genre or something like this. Like, it was actually quite crazy, but he was literally saying, like, I don't want to quote his words badly, but it was something along the line of, that apparently the people that engage with Do Not Research are really not interested in, like, traditional academia and media theory. The texts that bring those references heavily and methodologically are the ones that perform the worst, unless they're very well constructed. But he just said we need new canons.
I have a background in media theory, and Geert Loving was a big influence on me when I started, when I was a teenager. But something that I really notice now is that primary sources are not as crucial. Like, getting the story is what most people want. So, like, that's one of the biggest difference I see between me and, like, somebody who's getting a bachelor's right now. Like, when I was, like, my professors were drilling into me, go to the root, go to the root. And now people want the story, want someone else's take on it. Not because they're, like, intellectually lazy, that happens also. But there's definitely a huge shift in that. So I think that's one of the biggest things I see is, like, the idea of what the primary sources are. In media theory, obviously, it's, you get a lot into philosophy, and people are not engaging with that group anymore. And I mean, it's hard to say what. I would say part of it is that you don't have as much stability in academia for professors to be there for decades and support their students in particular ways, because some of it just takes a lot more time to engage with a primary source directly and to hear a story about it that you may or may not trust, or even to hear 10 different stories about the same source.
And I mean, I don't know if this is a controversial thing to say. I think what's important to keep in mind here is also, like, it's very connected to, like, money, like how we can afford to attribute certain kinds of attention to things. Narrative is, like, definitely one of the most powerful things anyone can, like, handle today, because attention is such a currency.
When you read those things compared to, like, the things you studied or, like, how you used to write them and stuff, what's your reaction / appreciation of those texts? Like, do you miss these primary sources, or?
I still engage with the primary source because I was educated in a very systematic way, so I just always think I don't want someone else to tell me what I should think that directly. I'm also learning other topics which are not related to media theory, because one of the things that I'm most interested in is also the distribution of knowledge in general and access to knowledge. And I think I would say personally I think we're in a dangerous point politically because there's so much market interest. But of course I find it really interesting that people have access to, like, science labs outside of the academic context. Like, before you wouldn't be able to have access to, like, getting certain, like, chemical compounds analyzed unless you're in the university or you're in a really high, like, corporate environment, and now you can send it off somewhere and get a lot. So there's definitely, I would say, to me, those are the most interesting positive things for people learning other things. I think, to me, what it means when you don't engage with primary resources is that you don't have time. For whatever reason, you feel a time pressure. And that's, I think, the most unfortunate thing about our moment in time is both artificial time pressure and a real time pressure because of the precarity of the social conditions.
If it makes sense, what becomes the point of this, aside from which we talked about, the obvious, which is to build an alternative to different models, existing models, to grow out a community online and give people different avenues and pathways to engage in criticism and critical dialogue. But what, if anything, is the grand project of the community itself? What are you trying to accomplish? What goals might you have? And I guess sort of the second part of the question I have is, if a person or entity becomes enough of an authority within it, this is still very nascent, and it has, different canonological points of view, sure, but if that person or entity becomes enough of an authority for these new people, or even a hybrid of both, aren't they themselves, how do they become, how do they avoid becoming institutionalized themselves?
No, I think it's super interesting you're asking this question, because I want to start by the last one. Like, this is something that I quickly mentioned at the end. It's beyond the individualistic, because actually that's also something that could be dangerous. And this kind of an island of a small critical thinker institution, right? That kind of say the same thing but different, and like instead of working together, they work or competing with each other. But at the same time, as you said, the problem with growth is that once it becomes too big, it needs its own structural system. And then you start becoming a little bit more like an institution. So this idea of scale is like really difficult, because you want to be able to like have your own school of thoughts and your own methodologies. But then when something becomes bigger or money gets involved, then you need to like separate things and organize things, which I think is what is happening with Do Not Research. Like now they're kind of creating an NGO around it or something, and like discussing how to best deal with it. So that's a very important question to which I don't have an answer, but it's very important to mention it indeed, that like creating so many small school of thoughts is actually doing a disservice to some extent, because it's like similar but different. And at the same time, it's also a manner to keep the scale low so it doesn't become this like power figure. And the first question, like what's the point? In the scope of critical internet research, I think it's just doing critical awareness around all these topics that perhaps like would not be treated with the same pace and the same, let's say, urgency, but that's one thing, of course. But the thing I would say specifically is like, there's the idea of course, democratization of knowledge, whatever, you could say vulgarization of knowledge, etc. But I think also it's like bringing the critical awareness to a lot more people, because I think that what comes with this digital plenitude is also the idea that like critical thinking, like not wanting to say it with like capitals, but like is affordable to a lot of people. And although that might sound like, okay, everybody's going to do theory now, at like there's no more theory, I think it just shows that more people are able to engage with critical discourse, and I think that's actually quite a good thing. And bringing it to the personal, for example, when I did the podcast, although some episodes are a bit, I think, obscure because they're so specific, I think for me it was really trying to think critically and engage with technological progress, because I'm afraid that otherwise it's just going to keep on growing and expanding in the most like market/optimized way. And I think if more and more people become aware of that, then hopefully in a best possible world we will have a say. But what's the point? Yeah. It's a good question.
I think this is really like, here I really have to think about like tactical strategies, like, because you also interviewed like Alex Kicho, who's doing this whole thing about girl theory and the girl stack, and this is also really like a tactical project about how to participate or pragmatically participate or exist in a time that in an era, whatever. I don't know how to phrase this without sounding really cliched, but it's about like what are pragmatic ways to continue doing research that is relevant and that is responding to the times, and it's like definitely in that way also a project and an experiment, I would say. But yeah, I would really refer here to like this tactical media kind of approach of like being pragmatic about platform dynamics and their kind of influence on our lives as researchers as well. But thinking about that in a kind of slightly empowering way.
Would you say that platform dynamics are different than human sources, like than any dynamic human involvement? Would you say they have, like, do you know any specific characteristics of platform dynamics that you? Because I when you said everything comes down to attention economy, I'd like to argue that I don't think everything comes down to market logics, but that there's a lot of things beyond that, and that eventually, as the market continues to grow, eventually we will outgrow it with our practices, I think, I would argue. then like the platform, isn't that just another marketplace, kind of, or another city center, or however you'd like to call it, like another point where people meet and exchange? Or do you, in your research, like, have like a specific characteristic to the platform that you'd say, no, this is very different?
The algorithms and like artificial intelligences or like machine learning changes a lot of things about that. So we're producing knowledges in places that require maybe like also like an attunement to this cyborgian attention economy.
If I can add something to this, I think like when we can outsmart it, I think it's like when we can bring back the human intelligence in it. Like, for example, I did a research project which was called Subsite, and basically it's just claiming that whatever attention we're working with right now is like using such big money from advertisers and not redistributing anything. And one example that I can show, which I think is very interesting, is that during the Black Lives Matter, a lot of YouTube channels were making like a selection of music from like black artists, and then they were putting it on YouTube, and they were saying if the entire world right now goes and see this YouTube video, the revenue from the ads is going to be so big, and this can be redistributed to charity. So there was this idea of like how to actually best use the attention economy to like disseminate money. Just, you know, like there's market logics, but like maybe there's loopholes that we can best use because we're a little bit smarter than the machine. And I mean, there's like an entire complexity that come with those questions and stuff, but like it's just saying that there's those systemic workings of stuff, but perhaps, and I mean, you know, if it was easy, it would already be done, you know, so I don't mean to say it's easy, but there's certainly ways to subvert it to our best interest, I think. And that also applies to, that applies to many different practices that are like hosted on the platform, I think.
I just wanted to ask, maybe also as a nice like end of the conversation, when it comes to network culture, what do you think is like the best case scenario that you want to see in 5 years? And maybe what are like some of the things that you're weary of, kind of in like the big scope of things?
I wish initially for more people to like know and learn and engage in that, so hopefully more and more people feel concerned to demand change from like the state or corporations when it comes to internet and technology. But I'm just a little bit afraid that no matter how many people know, I just really don't know about ethics and regulation of technologies. Like I really don't know what it will take actually, because we see more and more the states being very mindful about doing regulations because they're so afraid of corporation going elsewhere. You know, so they're like, oh, we want the added value to our economy, and if we put regulation on this company is going to go elsewhere. So I feel like as long as there's not a universal banning, it's going to be super hard to regulate. And so I feel like for me, the initial, let's say, ideology that I had as when I started doing this, I was like, okay, more awareness, more critical thinking around technology maybe leads to more demand and then structural change. But now that we see how this market interest is like shaping everything, I'm just more thinking maybe we all get the toolbox to create alternative media, alternative platforms. And I know it's not super revolutionary because it's only a few people, but I just don't really know anymore if we can rely on like the states to regulate these kind of things. I don't know. I don't want to sound too doomed, but I'm just seeing it more and more, specifically thinking about AI, for example. If AI is meant to stay, it would be amazing if all the corporations that are making millions on the back of artists, writers, translators and stuff could redistribute or would have to redistribute 20% of their tax income to funding. Like you would think, okay, let's just bring this back into the loop so like young people can do something about it. But I don't think they were going to do it, because if you implement this and you say, okay, France, you do that, they'll be like, yeah, sure, I'm going to go to Ireland. And then, it's always going to be this endless, like, chasing of the base place to make more profits. And then, but I don't know, I feel like maybe there's demand. I know that in Australia right now they're discussing this. I don't know to what extent, but the idea really of artists' private property over what is being fed into AIs. But you know what's terrible is that apparently, from what I heard, I don't know the details of it, but that like the tech companies are working with very slim, low terms that makes a difference, in the sense of saying, oh, but we're not copying, we're learning. So in the book of law, it's not stealing. You know, it's like all the possible ways will be used to just basically don't have to redistribute. And I don't know, I don't want to be too, I don't know what we can do. But that was my initial ideology, and I feel like now seeing that the states and corporations don't seem to really care so much, maybe, yeah, creating alternative platforms, creating alternative discourses, maybe opting out of the platforms, which I'm not doing myself, I admit. But yeah, that's my take.